Test. Okay. Welcome to another season of Faithful Questions. Glad to be here this evening. Glad to see everybody online. If everyone here can come take a seat, the taskmasters of live streaming always run a tight ship, so need to get rolling on that front. Let's begin with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Heavenly Father, you gave us the church, and you also gave us the wisdom to know that we need more than the church to organize our lives. Help us to be wise enough to know the implementation that is most pleasing to you, so that we can make sure that this earth is as close to your kingdom as possible. We ask all of this through Christ our Lord and Savior, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Okay, welcome everybody. Good to have everyone here this evening. For those of you here in person, we have, of course, refreshments in the back. Our only request is that you do not come across the front. You're welcome to go back and around, but please don't cross the middle, don't cross the front. We don't want anybody tripping on cables or accidentally in the screen. We do have a tip jar over there. This is not funded by the parish. It is funded by us. So if you would like to have snacks in the future, you have to put money in the jar. If you put enough money in that we can afford lobster, we'll get lobster. If you put enough money in that we get granola bars, we get granola bars. So it's really up to you what we have each time. But let's go ahead and get started into the talk. First, we're going to talk about what the church sees as the purpose of government. Why do we have to have this at all? Why isn't the church the only entity? What role does government have to play? Then we're going to take a little bit of a trip down memory lane to the history of the various interactions that the church has had with governments over the millennia. And there's a lot to understand how the church talks today. It is valuable to have a sense of what was and how we got here. So we'll talk about a number of things there. Then after the intermission, we'll get to more the heart of the question of tonight. But I think that backdrop of how we got to, because from the church's perspective, the American experiment's brand new. I mean, it's a toddler, right? I mean, we've been around for so long. We're just getting rolling here. So going through that history will then help us set up understanding the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution and what it tries to set up as far as the government's relationship to churches. And then how the church has reacted to that, what it sees in that, and also how that's changed over time. And then finally, we'll kind of finish up with a short segment on what we are called to as American citizens to be Catholics in this pluralistic society that we're in. Some introductory slides first. Questions. Everyone's welcome to ask questions whenever they feel like it. But the key thing in person, and if I get one complaint online, this is it. They can't hear your questions. And so we have a microphone that we take around to you. So if you have a question, raise your hand. Our live stream team will bring you the microphone. And the key is you have to basically swallow the microphone. It needs to be right against your lips. Like if you're really COVID sensitive, have it 1 millimeter away. If you're not, you can touch it, okay? So otherwise, it just gets very quiet very quickly. So make sure to wait for the microphone. We'll bring it to you. Hand it back when you're done. If you're on the live stream and you'd like to ask a question, we have a comment section with every YouTube live stream. The key is you have to get logged in on YouTube for that comment section to open up. If you're coming in unlogged in, it just won't show the comment section. So on your computer, under YouTube, there's a login thing in the corner. Get logged in using any Google account you have, your Gmail account, your Google account, your YouTube account. It doesn't matter. Any of those will work. And then the comment section will open. You're free to chat with everybody else in the comment section. Say, Deacon Ken's doing a horrible job tonight, whatever you feel like. But if you want me to respond to whatever it is you're saying, start the comment with all capitals, Deacon Question dash, and then whatever you have to say. And then our staff here will read it out, and all of you will know what's asked, and we'll go from there. If you have somehow magically managed to survive life without some kind of Google account, first, congratulations. But second of all, we do have an alternative, which is you go to deaconken.org/blog/chat. There's an open chat section there. Let's hope there are no bots listening because they'll take it over. But if you're able to go there, you're probably not going to find as many people, but you're welcome to chat if you would like and also ask a question, and we're monitoring that as well. Okay, so with those formalities out of the way, let's get into the purpose of government. So I'm going to use two sources here, and there's a lot of text here, but I wanted to put all of it, and I'm kind of go through it relatively quickly. There is a section in the Catechism, it's Part 3, Article 2, and it has all sections do this, they have an in brief at the end of it that kind of summarizes the whole thing. And it was a little long, but I thought it was short enough that we could try to work our way through it. And the paragraph numbers are right there. First statement they make is, there is no authority except from God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. So basically what the church is saying here is, every authority that exists in your life is one that in some way has been ordained by God. Along those lines, though, every human community needs authority in order to endure and develop. So God does allow for governments, for parishes, for sailing clubs, for anything where you need to have some sense of organization. That inevitably means you need some sense of authority within it. And so the church is recognizing that is true, that we need authorities in our life to be able to operate and do well as a community. The political community and public authorities are based on human nature and therefore belong to an order established by God. So it's kind of ping-ponging back and forth here a little bit, suggesting these things come from God, but they can be part of every part of our life because every part of the human community needs it. But we have to remember that everything we do in some way is ordered towards God, and so that has to be there. And so to those ends, authority is exercised legitimately if it is committed to the common good of society. To attain this, it must deploy morally acceptable means. So it's kind of a different way of saying the same thing. If it's going to be ordered towards God, that means it has to be ordered towards the common good. And to that end, that suggests there's probably going to be a diversity of political regimes that are legitimate, that different people in different places need different things, have different ideas of what's going to work best. What the church really wants to focus on is, how are they oriented? Are they oriented towards trying to do the right thing? And if different communities come to different solutions as how to accomplish that, that's okay. They just need to be ordered correctly. And kind of along those lines, that there are moral limits to these things, and they need, and the exercise of freedom is very important. The church says that a lot in its sections about governments, that freedom is a very important thing, which is something, by the way, that relatively speaking is new in the discussion of this. Historically, the church was less concerned with that, and as time has rolled on, it has realized the wisdom of governments that are very respectful of individual conscience rights and general freedoms, including freedom of religion. And then there's a bunch of sections on what the common good is. I'm not going to read those in detail. But the one thing I did want to call attention to is 1926, which is the dignity of the human person requires pursuit of the common good. And this is one of those very interesting things that I think every society, including ours, struggles with. There's the good of the collective, and there's the good of the individual. And the church is trying here to point out that both of those must be maintained. If you so emphasize the collective that the individual feels stomped on, well then every individual is feeling stomped on, and therefore the collective good isn't being helped. On the other hand, there are places where the individual right can be so excessive as to harm the common good. So there's a balancing act that the church sees in those things. But it has to be rooted in this understanding of the dignity of each human person. And it is the duty of the state to defend these things. So in a lot of ways, the church is not too different than what most people would think in this area. It recognizes that there's our need for authorities in the world, and what it's really, and it's recognizing that people have different perspectives on what will be good, and it just wants us all to remember the idea of this needs to be for the good of the person and the good of the community of persons, and that must be on our mind when we are doing these things. All of what you see in the Catechism is based on source documents that were the places they first came up with these ideas. And so the key one here for the idea of government comes from the Second Vatican Council. So if you were to have looked at the footnotes in the Catechism, you would see a bunch of GS paragraph numbers. And for those who know, GS is Gaudium et Spes. So this was the Vatican II document called The Church in the Modern World. It was one of the four key documents of the church, of the council, And chapter 4 is the life of the political community. So for the topic we're on tonight, that's the key space. And so much of what you see in the Catechism comes from there. So what I would encourage you to do, because I have a lot I want to cover tonight, is to read both that section of the Catechism and the 4th chapter of Gaudium et Spes, which is not long. It's 10, 12 paragraphs. Okay, maybe 20, but it's not like a book, right? It's not ridiculously long. To get a fuller sense of these things, to understand the nuance and the details. So that's really where the church is today. And so now we're going to take a bit of a change in mindset, and we're going to talk about history. Because the church has been through a lot of different phases when it comes to its interactions with governments. And you can't really understand where it is today with the United States without understanding that. So, most of us know this first thing. The very beginning of the Catholic Church was a place of persecution, right? We were an illegal religion within the Roman Empire. And I would say that from the very beginning, the idea of freedom being important goes all the way back to our roots when the Roman Empire was in charge. We wanted freedom to exercise our religion, and we weren't getting it. Lions, burning at the stake, all kinds of bad problems. It wasn't pretty. And that was true for the first 3 centuries of the church. One of the things I always think we need to do for ourselves when we're talking about the history of the church is to measure the time that's being discussed in a time that makes sense to us. So Christ died in approximately 30 AD, so this is 313 is when the persecutions finally officially ended with the Edict of Milan. That's 280 years. So we are still, so our country is now, 240 years old, 250 years old, somewhere in that range? We are still a few decades away from how long the Catholic Church was in a place of persecution in the Roman Empire, right? For us, it's just like, those first few centuries. That's easy for us to say in retrospect, but if we really want to understand how formative that was to the church, the entire length of the American experiment is shorter than this period of time. It was a long, long, long time. It's just that we've been around for even a lot longer. So that persecution ended in 313 AD when Constantine the emperor converted to Christianity and released the Edict of Milan, which many people misunderstand. They think it was when they made Christianity the official religion or things like that. No, that was just the legalization of Christianity. It was saying Christianity is now legal. Now, if the President of the United States decides he's a vegan and that's the best thing that you should do, lots of people are going to jump on the vegan bandwagon, right? Particularly people who want some political influence, those sorts of things, right? So, obviously, legalizing it was an important step, but it was also the symbolic value of the emperor himself being Christian was very important. So it wasn't just legal at that moment. It was legal and hip, for a better word, right? Everybody wanted to be in on this thing that the emperor was. Maybe he and I can be buds at Mass, kind of thing, right? So yes, it is true to say it was only just legalized at that point, but it would be also unfair to not understand the favor it received at that moment as well, because Constantine was the emperor and was Christian. And so it very quickly became the dominant religion. Everybody wanted in, and it's a cool religion, so it's not hard to get in when it's cool to go along with that, right? It wasn't the official state religion, and by state religion I mean officially on paper. If you asked the average citizen, do we have an official religion for our state? That didn't happen until 380. There were a few emperors between Constantine and when this happened, and that was the Edict of Thessalonica that made it official. It was now the official state religion. In that era, every country had an official state religion. That's how the way it worked. We've been on a long, multi-millennia movement from countries, or really much smaller communities than countries, and that's all they had, were, by definition, everybody in that country was that religion. Full stop. If you weren't, you won't need to watch your back. You're probably going to be dead soon, kind of world. To slowly evolving to tolerance for some amount of people in the community who weren't the official religion, to being in a place where it was in the 3rd century where actually there was a little bit of openness, and even though it was paganism was still the official religion of Rome, even the emperor was something else. But still in this place where the idea of official religion was pretty much how it was everywhere, and eventually the Roman Empire had to align to what its people were, and so the official religion became Christianity. And that was the world the church lived in. The idea that we might have overshot the mark by going from persecution to now potentially being the persecutors was a little hard for us to understand at the time, because that's just the way the world was. They couldn't imagine anything else. The next big evolution after the Roman Empire was when it collapsed. There was a bit of political chaos, and that's quite an understatement. And it left this huge power void. You now had regional monarchs, if you will, but they were of a much lower variety with much lower power. There was a lot more back and forth with this small community sacking that small community. And it was a mess. And the church recognized that it was a mess. And it was doing its best, because a lot of these were fellow Christian communities, to get them to play along with each other and be nice to each other. Within a century or two, things in Italy were such a mess that the supposed kind of ruler of the region, and he was from what is today France, basically said, and the way it was phrased was, I am going to make a donation of my lands to the Pope. My lands in what is now Italy to the Pope. What he was really saying is, this area is a mess, please take it off my hands. You look to have the bureaucratic organizational competence to do that. And so, being a fellow Catholic myself, I'm optimistic that you're going to be able to do a better job with this than I am. And so he donated this, similar to how we have that jalopy in our front yard that we can't even figure out how to get rid of it at the dump, so we donate it to Cars for Kids, right? That it was that kind of thing. Which from what I hear is a lot harder to do these days, but I don't know. And that made the Pope a king. He was a king just like Pepin in the, it was really the Franks was the name of his thing, but we today call it France, in charge of about 50% at that point of the middle of Italy. So not the bottom of the boot, not the top up in the mountains, or by the city with all the canals. Venice, thank you. But the heart in the middle, Rome, all of those areas was now this country called the Papal States. So the church was in the government business officially. To some degree, this is a bit of a regression in history, right? It had been slowly, the world had been moving away from that, where, yes, there might be an official state religion, but the religious authorities were different from the secular authorities. And so for the church to now be in charge of a region kind of changed things. And I would argue in a way that ended up in the long haul being negative for the church. Now, I don't think their motives at the time were bad. I think they just were in the middle of chaos and were doing their best to help put back together the pieces. And because most of the people were Christian, the hope was that they might be able to bring some order to things. I mean, what country wants to attack your religious leader's country, right? Like as a minor aside, I went to the Notre Dame football game a few weeks ago when Cal played Notre Dame, and I'm a big Cal fan. I have season tickets. I'll be going down there in a week. And sitting there in the background, Jesus is cheering for Notre Dame, right? And it was really hard to cheer for Cal with my Lord and Savior cheering for the other team, just visible from the stadium, right? So one would think that if I was a king in southern Italy, I might have a little reluctance about attacking my pope, right? That would probably be a little hard for me to do. So it did bring political stability to the region. This is one of those we don't remember how long it was true. The Papal States existed until 1870. Again, we're not even at the 100. We're basically at the 150 years now. This is really new for the church not to have a significant country that is its own. Think about how quickly after that happened, we stopped having all Italian popes, right? Because it was in the 1970s. Within a century of this happening, we went from a world where every pope was Italian. Why? Because it was a country. It wasn't just a church. It was a country. And who's going to be king of the Italian country? An Italian, right? Within 100 years of that, no, we were just a church, and therefore we haven't had an Italian pope since the 1970s. Not that we couldn't have one, but there's no bias towards that being true anymore. So this was pretty recent that it fell apart and has really been the bulk of the history of the church. More than half the church, we have been, our leadership at least, has been half country, half religion. Now, the Papal States didn't control everything, and they weren't actually a particularly aggressive group. There were not many wars of aggression fought by the Papal States. There would be defensive wars and reclaiming wars. So like when the Muslims came and took over most of Italy, the papacy and the political leadership had to go to Avignon in France. And they eventually came back and reclaimed the Papal States. But they were not growth-oriented. And most kings through the Middle Ages were growth-oriented. They wanted bigger regions, more territory. And they would do what they can to expand, sometimes by marriage, sometimes by war, you name it. So the church was, because pretty much all of Europe at this point was Christian, the church was interested in having some control outside of its little country. And its solution to this was the Holy Roman Empire and its influence. So Charlemagne, you've all heard Charlemagne, one of those noble characters in history. I find it a little bit ironic that he's the son of the person who gave the Pope the Papal States. This may have been a little bit more of an inside job than we used to know, right? Obviously, his motivations could have been pure. But from a modern sense, I think we look with a little bit of a raised eyebrow. Oh, so the son of the guy who gave you the big financial contribution, he gets to be king of the Holy Roman Empire? I see how it works, right? But nevertheless, Charlemagne had done a lot of expansive efforts, and he was very dedicated to his Catholicism. And wherever he expanded to, he worked very hard to make sure those people were Catholic too. And so he got the blessing of the Pope. And this became a real seminal moment for the idea of coronation. I don't know how many of you have watched the Netflix series called The Crown. Any watches that? Couple in the back? Yeah. Particularly in the early episodes, they really talk about this idea, right, that the Queen's responsibility doesn't come from the people, it comes from God. And that's why you're coronated by a bishop, all of those sorts of things. Now, obviously, the Anglican Church isn't aligned with Rome, but the ideas come from this era. And the idea here from the church was, okay, you know, those people in your realm, they're all of our religion. And so you want to cooperate with us because we can be the one to smooth things over and we can be the one to cause trouble. So we want you to work with us, and if you work with us, we will bless your authority as a civic leader and coronate you king. And your role as king will no longer just be physical, it will be divinely ordained. Doesn't that language start to sound a little bit like some of what you see in the Catechism, right? This idea that political leadership can be, ordained by God in a certain way, right? That language is not new. It has a long history. And they used this thing not just in the Holy Roman Empire, but in the surrounding countries, Spain, etc. They definitely used coronation and the ability to withhold coronation as a power tool to get the countries in Europe to be cooperative. So that was their main tool. When they wanted something from the country, like, please feed your people, they'd say, you know what, your son is not going to have a coronation by us unless you take care of your people. If your reign can't do this, we hear there's that disaffected uncle who lives out in the countryside, we'd be happy to coronate him, right? So get your act in line, get some food to your people, solve these problems. That was a tool that the church used. I bring this up because the mindset of the church was talk to the top. Right? Go to the leaders. If there's a problem in a country, go to the king, go to the dukes, go to the people at the top of the spectrum and say to them, these are the problems we're seeing, and we want you to fix them. So that when we now have the next phase in history of now we're seeing secular governments, democracies, these sorts of things where they can no longer wield the power through coronation, they want to use the same technique of going to the top. Concordance was the tool that they would use. A concordate is just a treaty by another name. It is a treaty between the church and that country. So when France became a democracy after it really tested out how good the guillotine was, it then, the church says, okay, we can't control King Louis anymore. Let's go to the democratically elected leaders and let's put a treaty in place that will be our means of working with that country. We can get rights for our church members. We can make sure they're doing the right things. And many countries to this day have active concordats with the Catholic Church. And they have things that would be unthinkable to Americans. In Germany, part of your tax dollars get collected and get sent to your church. And that was started by the Catholic Church. They said, you're collecting the taxes. The church can use that money for good charitable purposes. Let's put a treaty in place where you give some of your tax money to us for us to take care of some of the charitable problems that need to be solved in this country. And to this day, when a German sends in part of his paycheck as his income tax, if he wrote on that form Catholic Church gets that money. Now, if you're Lutheran, the Lutheran Church gets the money. So it's not one where religious freedom isn't respected. Not every person gets taxed by the church. But could you imagine that here in the United States, the idea of that part of your salary was going directly even to your own church? I mean, maybe it's going to be about the same you would give anyway, but it's just not how we look at the world, right? So these concordats were very universal. And the point I want to bring up as I kind of go into intermission here is, in the history of the world, even the other democracies like France, the first country to say, not we want to strive for a harder bargain, we need to work harder at what the terms may be, we don't like what your terms are, here's what we want instead. The U.S. was the first country to say, there's nothing you could offer. We just don't do that. We don't have agreements with religions. It's not allowed in our Constitution. And it left the church in a quandary. Its model of how it influenced the political power in a country was completely upended. It had no idea what to do. It didn't have any coronations to work with. It didn't have any concordats to work with. It had nothing. And I'll leave you with that cliffhanger as we go into intermission. A couple of reminders, particularly for those in the live stream. So on the live stream, you're about a minute and a half behind us here. Between all the buffering and all of that, if you were to have had a laptop in this room, if I clapped my hands, it wouldn't clap on your screen for like 60 to 90 seconds. I bring that up because it makes it hard to ask a question. I'm 4 sentences down the road by the time we get that question. So this is a great time during the intermission to ask a question, because we can queue them up during the intermission and then have them answered afterwards. So we'll have a big block just after intermission, and then we'll have another big block after the conclusion. So if you're at home and you're envious of all the wonderful snacks we have here, first enter your question and then go to your fridge and get your snacks. You have to bring your own. But I used to do that at a work meeting. I was remote, and they would have donuts in the local room, and they'd be chomping there every Friday morning. And so I'd go to the donut store every Friday morning just so I wasn't like listening to them eat their donuts. Like, fine, I'll bring my own. That was part of why I was what I was. But in any case, enter your question now. Same thing as before. Go make a comment on YouTube or at deaconken.org/bogs-chat. Then go get your refreshment, and we'll answer your questions on the far side of the break. And for everybody here, we have refreshments. Don't forget about the tip jar, and we'll have question times after the intermission. Test. Test, test, test. Okay, we're back. After our little Vatican bells there. Those are actually the big bells in the Vatican, if you're curious where the sound comes from. All right, question and answer. We'll start with what we have online. Nothing online. I've so brilliantly illuminated the subject, there were no questions. Good to know. Questions here in the room? Anybody have a question they'd like to ask? Okay, well, feel free to raise your hand at any point. I'm kind of looking all around, so don't think that a little like this is going to do it. You need to give me the big over the head. Okay. All right, so we're going to switch gears here, and we're going to start talking about the American side of things. And I think there is a great deal of confusion in this space, and I'm not even talking as a church member now. I'm just talking as an American. There is no, and I want to be very careful with my words here. If you go reading the Constitution, you will never find the words separation of church and state. Separation of church and state is a summation of a few other things that are in the Constitution. And I'm not saying it's a bad summation, but we treat it as if it is this single molecular block that can't be broken apart. But actually, there are multiple underlying principles that we need to understand. And when we do that, we start to see some nuance that we wouldn't otherwise see. So, the key part of the Constitution is the First Amendment. And here is exactly what the First Amendment says. No changes, nothing. By the way, as a bit of an aside, I was surprised how many Google searches it took me. I think I was on my third search before I was able to get the exact words. I found thousands of articles about it, but it took a little honing, like First Amendment. No, that doesn't do it. Text of First Amendment. And you see these things about lawyers, whatever. Original text. You having to hone it down to get to that where it's easy to find anyway. So anyway, here's what it says. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people to peacefully assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So there's a lot in there. And obviously not all of that is about religion, although I think more of it is about religion than we think. We tend to only look at those top two items, which I will get into in a minute, but I would say the right of the people to peacefully assemble is part of what our faith is about. And in fact, when I'm pretty sure that when there was the arguments about whether we could have church again during COVID that went to the Supreme Court, part of the argument was about it was a combination argument of you can't abridge religion and you're allowing other people to peacefully assemble, therefore you have to allow them to peacefully assemble. So that, I think, is a particular part of that. But the biggies there, no law respecting the establishment of a religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And these are called the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. They are two separate things. We treat them as if it's kind of one, but if you look around the world, you realize they are really not the same thing and should be treated separately. Let's start with the Establishment Clause. So, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of a religion. What does this mean? This means that what happened with the Roman Empire of the official religion is paganism, and now eventually the official religion is Christianity, we are not allowed to do that. The U.S. government, and actually here's a minorly interesting question, but can a state do it, was a question for a period of time. Because remember, the Constitution applies federally, and there's a lot of things that states can do that the federal government cannot. We've eventually reached the place where no states can't establish a religion, but there was a period of time where that was an open-ended question. But it prevents the state, the government, from having an official religion, for saying, our official religion is veganism, I don't know, whatever we wanted it to be. Right? It is not allowed for us to do that. It is very important to state this is not about freedom of religion. It's about what is official, right? So the official color of California could be green. That doesn't mean I have to wear a green shirt. It's just the official color. It may be encouraged, but it isn't required. So Establishment Clause is not about what we are allowed to do. It is about what the government is not allowed to do, which is stay for itself an official state religion. And today, in the world, there are a total of 43 countries, many of which you would think of as free, that have official state religions. Top of the list is Britain. They have freedom of religion. You can be Muslim, you can be Catholic, although it didn't used to be true, but you can be whatever you want in Britain. But the country is still officially Anglican, right? That is the official religion. Catholics have it too. Poland, the official state religion is Catholicism. And there is about 10, 15 governments that do have Catholicism as the official state religion. I believe Spain does as well. A little bit more of a unique case, but worth mentioning, Vatican City is a country, and surprise, surprise, its official religion is Catholic. You can't be a citizen of it unless you're like a very special bishop, so everyone there is really Catholic. It's the citizen-wise, but obviously they're Catholic. Finland, I didn't know this till I was doing my research for today, officially Lutheran in Finland. Actually, all of theirs was the one where it was most clear. The other Nordic countries, it seemed to be more related to that the king or queen was supposed to be the head of state, and they were also supposed to be the state religion, which is Lutheran. But it seemed to be a little more disconnected from the secular government, and those countries have a looser relationship to their royalty than, say, do the British. But Finland was the one where it was most clear-cut. Their official religion is Lutheranism. And then, of course, you have the Islam countries. The Islam countries are much more likely not to have freedom of religion along with their official state religion, but some do. Turkey, for the most part, has freedom of religion, whereas Afghanistan most certainly does not. And then you have a country like Israel. Israel's official state religion is Judaism. And actually, there's a lot of nuance there. I will touch that topic with the 10-foot pole another month. Yeah. Okay, so that's the Establishment Clause. It's not about whether the citizens are allowed to do what they want. It's whether the government has a preference, whether tax dollars and all kinds of things at the government level are connected to some specific religion, right? In England, your tax dollars are going to make sure that all the beautiful Anglican churches stay beautiful. Right? Obviously, that's not happening for any church here in the United States. Then there's the Free Exercise Clause. And this is what I think most people think of when they think of the First Amendment. But it is only half of it. And to some degree, one could argue the less consequential one as the world is embracing religious freedom as a whole. 200 years ago, I would say it was a little more of an outlier, outstanding, but today it's pretty ho-hum. This prevents the U.S. from making laws that restrict religion, right? So I mentioned the case. If they have a law that says churches can't meet because of COVID, the law has to be written in a way that it's not about churches, because that would be restricting religion. They could make something that equally affected everyone. So, no city council meetings, no concerts, no. And if what the church was doing would fall into a bucket that was not defined just for them, but was equally applied across the society, then the government could restrict us in regards to COVID or whatever. particularly in the case of a pandemic emergency. The threshold of that gets a lot harder when you're not in a situation like that. But this is what it means. It means the government is not allowed to have any law that restricts any person from practicing their religion. And there are lots of cases that have gone to the Supreme Court about this. Most countries have some level of this. I think it was 178 countries have some form of religious freedom. It's a bit more of a gradient. There are entities that try to grade it. Ironically, they do not put the U.S. at the top. We were number 8 in one of the lists I saw. And I don't know enough to know, but the other 7 looked like they were pretty fully religiously free places. So but I think actually Finland was in that list. So state religion, but based on this entities, and I don't know how good they are, they would argue they have more freedom of religion in that country than we do. There is a minority of countries that significantly or completely restrict religious freedom. Islam-based countries tend to be the driver here, but nevertheless. But it is important to remember that, as I said before, there are numerous states that have a state religion and freedom of religion. And that's really important to drive home to prove that these two clauses do not have to be linked together. They are really independent things that we could argue both of them are good, but nevertheless are not necessarily go hand in hand. And as I said, the Catholic Church was really, because there were countries that had religious freedom, but they'd be willing to talk to the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church would come knocking and say, hey, we want to make sure we have a good agreement. And they, and they went to the U.S. and they said, no, we just don't do that. And they were dumbfounded. It's like, well, then how do we talk to you guys? What are we supposed to do with our citizens who are Catholic? And the answer more or less back was, our system protects that. You don't have to worry. Our thing will protect it. And their answer was, no, that's our job to protect that. That's what we're here for. It's our job to protect it. No, we'll take care of it. It was just a little bit back and forth, and it was a little bit of talking by each other. So let's get into that. So the church reaction. So we were just genuinely confused. Nobody had ever refused to negotiate with us. Sure, there'd been people we hadn't come to an agreement with, but they'd at least be willing to sit down and talk. And they might drive a bargain that we wouldn't like and vice versa, but they'd be willing to talk, and there was a theoretical path to success. And they weren't sure what to do. How do you deal with that? And they were also very fearful that while it may be on the surface that everything's free and open, that actually underneath the covers it wouldn't be, right? That this country was fundamentally a Protestant country for most of its history. I think only in the last 30, 40 years you could argue that that's somewhat changing. But for sure, Catholicism wasn't the center of this country. It was Protestant Christians. And so there was real fears that, yeah, you may say that, but we'd sure love to be able to drive a bargain with you to ensure that. And we were nervous because we said the fact that they're not willing to talk to us kind of reinforces those fears. Because everybody else would, why won't you? But we were officially neutral because the country spoke the right words about religious freedom for Catholics. We weren't quite willing to go whole hog into objecting. Occasionally a pope would get on his high horse and make a statement or two now and again, but big picture, we were a little bit of a wait and see. Let's see how this plays out. And what I'm talking about here is at the formation of the country. We're talking about, let's see, that would be early or mid 18th century, 80s. That kind of time frame. The 19th century is where we were probably at our most nervous. This was a period of not just notable anti-Catholicism, but pretty strong anti-Catholicism. If you look at people who share information about the history of anti-Catholicism in their country, most of what they're sharing of the worst of it is from the 19th century, because European Catholics fleeing countries like Italy and Ireland and Spain and Poland were the equivalent of today's Mexican immigrants. And I'm not trying to say that as a value judgment. I'm just trying to say the place they played in society was the same. It was a subject that people got worked up about. It was something that would get brought up in government. We have to do something. All of these people keep coming to Ellis Island. They're overrunning our country. We don't think they're loyal to the United States. We think they're loyal to that nasty Pope guy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It was a bad period in the United States for anti-Catholicism, and it made the church really nervous. And to compound that, in Europe, things were not going well for the church either. Secular governments were developing, and those secular governments, the government itself, not the people of the country, but the government, was often much more viciously anti-Catholic. What happened in a lot of countries was the Catholic Church had an arrangement with the aristocracy, with the secular governments that were being overthrown. And so when they were overthrown, the fact that the church was cozy with the people that were being overthrown meant ipso facto that must mean the church is bad, and therefore we are against it. And so you saw this in Spain. You saw this to a lesser degree in France. Countries that historically were Catholic connected, when they would have a secular revolution, would end up being some balance of stridently anti-Catholic, at least in certain circles within the government. And so the U.S. ended up getting grouped in, because we were secular, right? We didn't have a religion. We weren't all of these things. We were one of these nasty countries that was all secular and stuff, that are murdering priests and doing all of these nasty things. Sure, that wasn't happening in the U.S., but we were being grouped in with the countries that were. And the fact that there was all of this real anti-Catholicism in the country made the leaders feel like it's just around the corner. It hasn't happened yet, but it's coming. And so actually you do see a number of statements in the 19th century where the church is much more aggressive in condemning the American experiment without fully crossing the line into saying no dice. It was just like, this doesn't look good. God belongs as part of this discussion. You cannot leave God out, United States. Those kinds of words. And those things ramped up in the 19th century because of the actual anti-Catholicism in the country, coupled with this somewhat misperception of the European countries who had turned secular themselves. But then, ironically, the church started to see that we were different. Saw that unlike the Bolshevik Revolution and other things that were happening, we just kept plowing along with our religious freedom, and the anti-Catholicism waned a bit. And there never seemed to be any laws that prevented the church leaders from doing what they wanted to do within reason. And so by the 20th century, the church is now dealing with three kind of scenarios. Scenario number one, a country that was Catholic is staying Catholic. We love you. You're wonderful. But back of the mind of the church is, God, what happens if this goes wrong? What happens if this country becomes another, France or something like that? What do we do then? Then you had the ones that were already openly antagonistic, and those were kind of a lost cause. But now all of a sudden the U.S. looked a little better. It was like, we don't have to worry about them making that flip. Sure, they may not be exactly where we want them today, but maybe we like the idea that built into their system, they can't turn on us someday, right? And you started to see that in the 20th century, this idea of, man, if we can start to see governments that really embrace this idea of true freedom all the time, we're not stuck in the business we've been stuck in for the last 2 millennia. And that was the kind of revelation of the first half of the 20th century, and for sure World War I and World War II helped double down on this. We were seen in a very good light through all of that. So that by the time the Second Vatican Council rolled around, this growing idea that had been blossoming was in full bloom. And that's why you see the documents you do out of the Second Vatican Council that to some degree were pretty revolutionary within the church. It was now saying, no, we need to look at this differently. Freedom of person is important. Yes, things need to be ordered towards God, but we need to give each country freedom in how they are going to accomplish that. And if that's a country like the United States that has no state religion, so be it. This is not to say we don't have concerns. We still do. You will occasionally see popes and various leaders with their concerns. Our modern concern is mostly around the line of you're seeing secularists who are starting to now overstate the Establishment Clause restrictions and basically trying to kick all religions out of the public square. They're basically suggesting we don't belong in the public square, and that's what the Establishment Clause means. And if you see where the church is most vocal these days, it's about rebutting that. No. Atheism needs to be seen as a religion from this, and that means that also has to not be established by the government. So if you're saying atheism is the one religion that's allowed to say nobody else, that violates the Establishment Clause just as much as the Lutheran or Anglican or Catholic Church being the official state religion. And so we do push back against that. And then along those lines, we very much want to state that while, yes, there may not be an official state religion, and yes, everybody needs to be able to be free to practice their religion, that does not limit our right to be a moral voice. Because the other thing that's hiding in particularly Gaudium et Spes, it's less obvious in that section of the Catechism, is the church finally figured out how to solve the problem of how do we influence things in a country where we can't work with the leaders. And the answer is, you talk to the lay people, right? One of the big things of Vatican II, the lay people are the ones in the church who need to be responsible for changing the things that are wrong in the world. The priests and the bishops, they're responsible for making sure the church is in good shape, but the lay people are responsible for taking that religious leadership they're getting from their priests and bishops and taking it to their communities and their societies and their government. And it's the lay people's job to do that. So that's why, what document is it in? It's the church in the modern world. How does this church operate in this modern world? And then part of that is saying, this is how we work with governments. We work with governments by getting Catholics, lay Catholics in those communities to be a voice within those democracies to make the changes that need to happen. We're no longer going to the top. We're doing a groundswell from the bottom. And I think once the church realized that, it got a lot more excited, saying, hey, we have an avenue now for success. This is great. And that's why we're particularly worried about people saying, no, you're not allowed to do that either. Right? None of your moral voice. We don't want to hear your Catholic stuff in the ballot box or anything like that. No. Your morality doesn't count. And we really get worked up about that because now we're back to, you've given us no voice. If we're not allowed to talk to the top, we're not allowed to talk to the bottom, who are we allowed to talk to? And so we are still a very strong proponents of the idea that while, yes, a secular democracy that has no state religion can be very good, it can be a good form of government, the people within it need to be responsible for making sure it is oriented towards the common good and thus oriented towards what God would have for his people. Okay, so where does that leave us as U.S. citizens? Hey, right on time. It means we have to stand up for our faith. It means we have to be the people who are working in our society to make sure that Catholicism's principles are well represented in our democracy. And remember, one of our moral principles is the idea of freedom of conscience, including freedom of religion. Freedom of religion is not a secular idea. It actually came from Christians. It's a Christian idea that was so good that non-Christians have adopted it. And I'm fine with that. But let's not seed the ground as if it's not an idea we created and liked. It is a Christian thing to stand up and say, people have the right to be the religion they want to be. People deserve to have freedom of conscience. We'd love the opportunity to talk to them so that their freedom can lead us towards what we believe is the truth, but they have to come voluntarily. It can't be coerced, and a society can't be in a place where it is unduly coercing people. So we're acting out our faith when we stand up for religious freedom in our country. And that is just one of many ways we can do what we need to do. Well, I'm not a layperson anymore, but I'll join you for this. I'll be on the, they say deacons straddle the line. On this one, I'll be with you. So anyway, that's what we're called to do. The United States, the American experiment, as it's sometimes called, is a very interesting thing. It changed the entire dynamics of how we go about talking about change in society. And it is a huge upheaval and causes everybody to approach things differently. But it is one that looks to be workable. We got 250 years in the bank of showing it can work. And we need to do our part. We as Catholics need to be our voice of standing up for what is good. The common good, which includes religious freedom, which includes standing up for the less fortunate in our society. All right, on to our conclusion reminders. Again, for those of you on the live stream, get your questions in now, because when there are no more questions, we're going to shut it off like that, so there won't be time to ask one more. Get logged in on YouTube or go to deaconken.org/blog/chat and enter them now, so they'll be there when I finish my conclusion slides. And then for here, you'll just raise your hand when we get to the final questions. Conclusion. 1, history's complicated. There's a lot of baggage in our past of dealing with lots of different governments. And we have learned a lot from that, including from the United States. The church owes a debt of gratitude to the United States to showing it a different way that is workable for the church. But it is important that we understand the difference between religious freedom and state religion. And as Catholics, the only one we have to be committed to is freedom of religion. We could theoretically embrace, we're not required to, but we could embrace a model where we would want a state religion again. Obviously, that's an impossibility in our country in any time in the foreseeable future, but it is not something we are inherently opposed to, but it seems like it's been working out reasonably well. But we do have to be careful about those who want to overstate what that means and abuse it. All right. Last few slides, satisfaction survey. I forgot to photocopy them. Things did not go that well during setup today. Usually I have printed copies. So I guess for those of you here, if you'd like to do the survey, you have to do it online, which is not great. But just go to deaconken.org/blog. 10 minutes ago, the post went live. You can enter in whether you thought the audiovisual was good, whether my talk was good, all that kind of thing. So go there and do that. And for those of you online, if you expand the description, there is a link right there to go do that. I really appreciate the feedback. Everyone here, if they don't fill it out, they can still tell me as they're leaving what they thought. You know, hopefully they're nice, but they can tell me. You can't tell me. You're distant on a screen, and the only way you can tell me is by putting it by filling out a survey. It doesn't take but a minute or two, and it'll let me know how to improve. And I care a great deal. I'm very serious about the idea of feedback. If you put your email address and you want to say something more complicated, I promise you, I will respond. The other one that I also didn't print out, so you're going to have to do it online, is this is not a survey about tonight, but where these talks should go. Should we keep the snacks, or is it a waste of time and money? What topics do you want to see in the future? Do you care about daycare? So for those of you online, filling out the part about daycare of I couldn't come tonight because I don't have a babysitter, very helpful information. Everyone here could either get a babysitter or doesn't need one, so they're not the best ones to answer that question, but I need your feedback online in the separate survey, which you can find at deaconken.org/blog. So go ahead and fill this one out as well to help give me direction, not about how to make each individual session better, but what to do with the series as a whole. I just do this at the beginning of each year. You might hear it next month one last time, but then you won't hear it again until next fall. Our next talk is Tuesday, November 15th at 7 p.m. It's technically a week late because it's supposed to be the second Tuesday, and the 8th is the second Tuesday. There's a lot going on right then in that week, both here in the church and with the holiday and my wife's birthday, so we're going to push a week to the 15th because it's barely technically late. The topic is, how can I evangelize my non-Catholic friends? And hopefully, although I don't have it all lined up yet, it'll be a very different format. We're going to do a panel discussion of converts to the faith to have them talk about what were the key things in their life that helped them over the fence. And so they'll share a little bit about their story, about what brought them here, but with very much focused on the idea of educating others on how we can be those type of people who help them to become Catholic, and who was in their life that was important and why they were important and all of that. And since I am a convert myself, I will be one of the panel members. So that's something we're going to add this year. I have another idea for the spring as well for a panel discussion about bereavement, but that's the idea. It is possible that it all falls apart, and I'll just be telling you my thoughts in the normal format. So we'll see how it goes. And along those lines, if you know of any converts, or you yourself are a convert, or are interested in being part of the panel, reach out to me, put it in the survey results, send me an email, what have you. Hoping to have about 5 people. Future topics, the only one beyond that, I have stated what the topic will be. In December, we're going to do the classic, is there a conflict between faith and science? The schedule for the spring, starting in January, I haven't yet released. I want your feedback from the participation survey first. And I'm always looking for topic suggestions. A quick one, mostly for people online, go ahead and freeze frame if you want to get all the various links. If you want to email me, it's ken@deaconken.org. Hopefully you guys can all remember that. It's pretty easy. Finally, 2 more things. Spiritual direction. I have been offering monthly spiritual direction now for a couple years. I have 3 directees, and I think I'm helpful. I hope I'm helpful. But if you're someone who is interested in growing in your spirituality, I can probably take on a couple more people to direct. It is not free. Deacons are not paid. We have full-time jobs, and my time away from my family is precious. And so I do ask for $500 a year. If you had to go see a psychologist or something once a month, it'd cost you a heck of a lot more than $500 a year. So I do think that that's a reasonable rate. I know it's not no money, but it's also not, considering I went through a 2-year training program, all of that. So I do ask a lot of you, though. I do expect a full half hour a day of prayer, much of which I will be directing you towards, of do this, do that, try this out, to help you get a stronger relationship with God. If you're interested, go to deaconken.org/spiritual-direction or come talk to me. One of my directees loves it so much that he gave a $500 scholarship for someone who can't afford it. So if you're someone who would love to do this, and the reason you're not is because $500 is too much, I do have one scholarship available, so I will want you to I don't want to get into any gory details, but give us a quick justification of why you think you're eligible for that. And it, as I said, doesn't have to be complicated, but just to make sure. I don't want somebody who has plenty of money and is on their way to Hawaii at Christmas break, taking me up on that. I want it to be somebody who actually can't afford it. All right. Subscribing on YouTube. There are features you get on YouTube if you have 1,000 subscribers that you don't get before that. It's actually down to 760 as of the start of this thing. I got one subscriber this afternoon. If you are not subscribed to me on YouTube, I'd really appreciate it. I know it seems like a long way to go, but I remember a year and a half ago when it was like 920 to go. So we are making progress slowly but surely, and it will allow me to do things like promote the channel better and do things like embedding live streams and other web pages that you're not allowed to do till you get there. All right, questions? Looks like we got one in the back.
How did the church feel about the election of JFK being the first Catholic president?
I think pretty good. I'm not sure how much more there is to say there. Obviously with JFK, it was a big issue of how much his Catholicism was going to be a problem. There may have been a few church leaders who were a little bit nervous of how strongly JFK made it clear that he wasn't going to let his faith dictate his presidency. In kind of the way that we were just been talking about of, okay, there's a certain truth there, and yes, it can be stated, but there's concerns maybe that it might have overstated it and may have let other Catholic politicians, frankly, off the hook in properly representing their faith as an elected leader. But for the most part, church was like, yeah, sign that anti-Catholicism in the U.S. is waning. Just as the election of Barack Obama was a wonderful sign that major issues of racism were at least small enough that you could be elected president as a black man. And so the church kind of thought the same thing about JFK, that it was a sign that anti-Catholicism had similarly waned in an earlier era. I don't know. I don't know what else there is to say about that. Any other online, or was that it? That's it? Okay, so we'll go here. Nice and close.
Couple of comments and then a question. First of all, it was an excellent presentation. Learned a lot about history that I was not aware of. The other point was that you asked the laity to take action, start from the bottom, and go on up, stand for your faith. But it's a little frustrating when you see the discord, archbishops, bishops disagreeing with the Pope, back and forth, and doing it publicly in a very nasty manner, and discord going on in the Vatican itself. But, you have to just deal with it. The question is there a good answer to somebody today, and I've had this said to me, the church cherry picks what it wants in terms of the separation of church and state. In other words, it wants the state to stay out of certain things, but boy, we want money for our, education or books or so on and so forth, etc. That it just cherry picks whatever it wants when it suits its needs. Is there an answer to that, or just
I think so, although I don't know how satisfying it will be. Everything is on a spectrum, and there are always competing interests in every area. So the church, I think, tries to do a good job of having a healthy respect for things, but you seem to point to this, the idea of whether we would have vouchers for Catholic schools. And so someone could say, well, you don't want separation of church and state there. I think that's unfair. The Catholic Church is not saying we want vouchers, but only for Catholic schools. No, it's playing by the rules of our government, which is we have to be religion independent. That's the principle of freedom of religion. That's the principle of lacking establishment of religion. The interesting question is, what kind of things can the government fund without violating that? And the church is arguing that funding schools should be something that at least should be considered, and maybe there's some limitations that have to be placed on that, like you can't teach religion during the school day or things like that. But I think it's unfair to blanketly assume that that means you're against freedom of religion. No. If an atheist wants to set up an atheist school, frankly, they can already do that, and they can become a charter school. So to some degree, you could argue that we're lacking freedom of religion right now because the atheist school can do it, but we can't. I'm not saying these issues aren't without nuance, but my rebuttal in general would be, I think you're cherry-picking the idea of what freedom of religion is, and saying that every religious school should be able to get in on the money that the government has to educate children because part of Catholic or Jewish or Lutheran or atheist education is still reading, writing, arithmetic, is not inherently establishment of a religion. That's your opinion, and it's not the church picking and choosing. It's just a different attitude about that. And the church actually tends to be fairly consistent because it also thinks the same thing about charities, right? That like loaves and fishes, if there's money that are going to secular charities from the government, why can't loaves and fishes, if they're willing to follow the same rules, get access to the same, buckets of money? So the church is definitely doing those things, but it's playing by the rules of the U.S. system, and I think it's a little unfair to say that that's now somehow establishment of religion. I do understand that there are concerns. If you just start handing out money to the church without thought, eventually you do reach an idea of establishment of religion. So it is reasonable to hear the counterpoints of where those lines are, but to suggest that any time any religious entity gets $1 from the government, it's a problem, not so sure about that. Yeah.
This is sort of a church-state question, too. Similar. Does the church have any, this is regarding very visible politicians that, have anti-abortion stances, and the Pope will say one thing, and a bishop will say a different thing regarding communion or kicking them out of the church or these kind of issues. Is there any real Catholic law that should dictate that, or should there be a law? Should that be stated?
Ooh, you've stepped in the deep end now. We're going to have to tar and feather you on the way out. So I could give my thoughts on this, but I think actually the better thing to say, at least as a starting point, is the fact that many bishops and whatever disagree about this suggests it's an open point in the church. And if either side is arguing that it's not an open point in the church, they carry the burden of explaining why it isn't an open issue. And by the way, this has been an open issue in the church for centuries now, and it's not easy. My general feeling is the church should feel empowered to make it clear when a Catholic politician is stepping out of line with the church. Not because we're trying to discipline them for their politics, but because of the scandal it causes, and I mean that in the technical sense of the word, of other Catholics thinking the church's teaching is something it is not. to put this in a very different context, about the only way to get excommunicated in our church is to be somebody who is seen in the world as an authority of the church, and to say something that is blatantly directly against the church. The church feels the need to excommunicate them, not for them so much as for the purpose of making it clear to the world, this person doesn't speak for us. And that's the most we can do, right? We can say, no, you are not speaking for the church, and people think that you are because you're a priest or a bishop or a theologian from a major Catholic school, or. And so therefore we feel the need to make it clear to the world that this person is saying something that is not the faith, and therefore they will be excommunicated. I think it is reasonable for the church to find some mechanism. I'm not saying excommunication. I hope I'm making that clear. Some mechanism to accomplish the same thing with Catholic politicians, because I think there are plenty of people who, aren't that strongly connected to their parishes and whatnot, who do think that this means Catholicism is okay with that. And it would be really nice if we could find an effective way to do that, because it would take pressure off of some of these other things. Because I think a big part of the reason that people want, let's just, hit the nail on the head, Pelosi denied communion, is because they want it to be clear to the world that what she's doing is not what the Catholic Church believes. And if we could find some way to do that didn't insist on a sacramental punishment, I'd feel a lot better about it. Because I do think the sacrament is for sinners. All of the sacraments are. And that's how I want it. And you know why I want it that way? Because I'm a sinner. And I do not want a world where the church fundamentally is refusing sacraments to people because they misunderstand something about the church. A big way to get them back on the right track is through the grace of the sacraments. But I do think the church does need to find some way, and I'm not sitting on a lot of great ideas, to communicate to the world better these things, and I don't know what it is. Oh, yeah, if you want to follow up, go ahead.
I don't think the politicians are misunderstanding what they're doing.
No, not the politicians. I'm talking about the other people. The average Democrat in San Francisco who votes for Nancy Pelosi, knows she's Catholic because she stands up there and talks about her Catholic faith, who isn't that connected to their local parish and their community, who think, well, it must be okay. This lady's an active Catholic. She talks about it all the time. She goes to communion. She does all those things. The church must not care that much about this. It has the risk of doing that. And I think that's why a lot of people want that punishment, to make that clear that when she votes the way she does, specifically on abortion topics, she's out of line with the church. But I really would love to see us find a way to do it that didn't require using the sacraments as a punishment tool. That's my personal opinion. And I think this is a very open thing in the church. Obviously, the Archbishop of San Francisco has a very different idea than the Pope, has a very different idea than what's his name in New York. It's complicated.
Here's the problem with that one. Pelosi claims she's a Catholic, however, and she receives Holy Communion even though she is pro-abortion, and she's a public figure. She knows full well that in order to receive Holy Communion, the sacrament, she needs to be in a state of grace. I mean, we all know that sitting here. That's a real big problem. And out of compassion for Pelosi, she needs to be corrected, but she refuses to be corrected. She has been corrected by numerous archbishops, but she refuses. So there's a real problem there. But I was going to make another statement. Now I
Sure,
forgot.
that's fine.
So I'll pass the mic.
No, go ahead. If you had another point, go ahead. Okay. Yeah. The traditional model the church uses is that The penitent has to decide for themselves whether they are ineligible. That's been the history of the church. The church has been very reluctant for it to be the arbiter of whether people shouldn't be receiving. You might be right, and I can't look into Pelosi's heart, that she should be deciding for herself that she should not be receiving. But generally speaking, the church takes the attitude of our job is to educate Catholics about what the criteria are by whether they should feel that way, and they have to decide for themselves.
Is there a definition of religion in the Constitution?
You actually bring up a very interesting question, and no, there is not meaningfully. Now, I'm not a lawyer, and we have done things to refine the definition of a religion, but if you talk to your average Scientologist, that it becomes a very interesting topic. What is a religion? Yeah, it's funny how there's certain things, like when they wrote that, they just took it for granted. What does that mean? What is a religion? And to some degree, the United States has had to struggle with this. In fact, one issue that's on the table I didn't really get into is the whole difference between practicing your faith and what's the other word? Freedom of religion and freedom of worship. It tends to be the two phrases that are used. Worship, the people who would argue for the word worship would argue what that means is that you're allowed to go into the room where you guys worship and do that without interference. But the church would argue, and many others with it, that no, religion includes the right to go up to a poor person on the street because your faith demands it of you. Sorry, that's our camera going out. We're just going to stay on camera one for the rest. Yes, Andrew? Okay. Demand that, I'm all thrown off by that. Actually, we have a problem with that, Andrew, in that we won't have the second microphone if we don't get another battery in there. So go ahead and put a new one in. And if you guys last another 40-plus minutes, you're going to hear it again. So that's consider that your limit. So where was I? The idea that, no, doing work in the world, like feeding the poor, like, all of those types of things, is part of our faith, and that is part of religious freedom. There are a lot of little nuances there that are challenging, and I do believe some case law has developed within the Supreme Court and all of these things that has rounded it out. I can't say I can speak intelligently to that, but for the most part, the courts have been reasonably expansive and not taking that limited view of you only have freedom of worship, but understanding your religion in a much broader context. But then you get into things like, well, what are the limits of that? Does somebody who is blatantly not religious but wants to structure their organization in a way that is religion-like, is that a religion? It gets complicated quick. But you're right, there's a lot of nuance there and often gets overlooked. We just kind of assume, what a religion is. Along those lines, what is speech, right? In that same amendment, the right of freedom of speech shall not be abridged. Does that include my right to say something inflammatory on Twitter? Not sure. It's these things get interesting fast. But it's an excellent question. All right, let me... Hold on. Let's get the microphone to you.
1942, I think.
Yeah, you're on. You're good.
You there?
Yep.
I think in 1942, they had the case of Chaplinsky in New Hampshire.
I don't think I'm knowledgeable on that one.
A thing called fighting words.
Oh, right, for freedom of speech. Yes.
Speech would provoke violence and like that. And I think that's where they drew that line.
Right. That you're, particularly with police officers, you're allowed to insult them up until the courts would rule it to be fighting words. So you can go up to a cop or anybody and say, you're blah, 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 negative, blah, 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 blah. But the minute you say, and I'm going to punch you in the face, you've crossed the line from freedom of speech into inciting violence, right? And that is a reasonable line, the fighting words thing. But that's a good point. So, yeah, the courts do deal with these topics and get into it, and they get interesting really quickly.
Deacon Ken, I just have a quick statement, if I may.
Sure.
Am I on right now?
Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
I'm a big fan of relevant radio. I listen to it quite frequently, and there was a very excellent discussion on it yesterday about religious freedom.
Okay.
And the issue at hand was that I think we all are quite aware that religious freedom is at stake and has been. We have churches have been attacked across the United States and in other areas. There have been Christians and Catholics that have been attacked and murdered in parts of Africa. There's just terrible things that are happening. And so this ambassador, who was formerly a senator and is an ambassador, spoke to this topic, and he said, we're going to hear more about this topic, about religious freedom. So in the months to come, just wait for it. He's asking people to organize at our level. So.
Yeah, there are definitely places in the world, for sure, that do not have the sort of religious freedom we have here, and there are, in a lot of ways, we've been relatively complacent as we've seen the world as a whole slowly moving the right way over centuries, and what's worrisome now is there are certain places where we're seeing trends where that's being reversed. It's one thing to be patient to wait while a slow world comes to the right ideas. It's much more troubling when you're starting to see things go the other way. So, and yeah, there are issues of it in the United States. I think we do need to be careful to remember how big of a country it is, and one incident in Denver, 4 months ago does not a pandemic of violence make. But I mean, that individual action shouldn't be properly dealt with, but I think sometimes we forget just how massive of a country we live in, and a few incidents aren't necessarily a sign of a larger problem. And I mean that in every area. I think we're a little too jumpy these days with, if it bleeds, it leads, and therefore just one or two small incidents around the country will give people the impression that we have a outbreak of whatever problem it is, killing people, drunk driving, anti-Catholicism, just whatever it may be. And I think we need to be a little careful and try to take more of a statistical mindset to see whether things are really getting worse, as opposed to whether there just happened to have been a couple high-profile things in a recent moment. And there are some signs that there are some things that are not moving in the right direction. I don't want to be dismissive of that either, but we should also be a little cautious about letting one or two things tip our brain too strongly. Like very specifically, there was the incident after the Roe v. Wade decision was overturned where on one door in Chicago, like an FU or something was written on the church doors, not Chicago, Denver, it was written on the doors. And every bishop across the country sent out emails to all their priests and everything, get ready for the violence and all of this. And it got everybody on high alert. The ushers here were all looking at everybody. And I guess if I had been wrong, I should be careful. But I think we got everybody worked up because of one moment. And there's always going to be that one person who's a moron. And it was to our own disservice that we let that one incident trigger us so heavily. And as it turned out, in the 3 months that have followed, there hasn't been a lot. It's been, not that there's been none, but there hasn't been a lot in that space. There's been anger, but not violence. And that's a good thing that there's not violence. I'm happy about that. But we let one incident trigger us too much. And I think, Like my wife in particular, I was like, dude, chill out. It's going to be fine. But you're going to be on the altar. Yeah, and it'll be just fine. You probably can't hit me from way up there anyway. She hates when I say things like that. Because it's like it's real now, and I'm trying to just be dismissive. Anyway. Final questions before we wrap up? The bomb has a minute and 45 before it goes off, so we'll beat it to the punch. Anything online while I come in there? No. Okay, well, let's wrap up with the prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Heavenly Father, thank you for bringing us together today and for the many ways that you bless us. And thank you for the technology that allows us to live stream this and record it so others can see it. Thank you for whatever graces you gave me to hopefully state things reasonably well. As we go forth, help all of us to remember that each of us have a way we can be a voice for good, hands and feet for good, so that this world can be more to your liking. We ask all of this through Christ our Lord and Savior. Amen. Thank you, everybody, for attending. I really appreciate y'all coming out. Welcome.